Okay. Welcome everyone to this next session that's titled, provocatively I think, whether regional integration is utopian. The sets of forces that we're going to try and unpack in this session relate very much to dynamics that we have already previously discussed. This conference, this forum, is about new horizons on the global economy. It will not have escaped your notice that we seem to have spent all our time so far talking only about globalization. Of course, later on, we will have sessions on technical change, fintech, innovation, financial innovation. We will have sessions on global climate change. But for now, we continue on our discussion of the forces in globalization, but now zeroing in on regional integration. One of the more optimistic messages that came out of the previous session was when whatever the differences in nuances on the global system, on the global international architecture, everyone seemed to agree that we should hand off to regional institutions and regional integration to solve the problem. Perhaps that might not be the best way to try and treat globalization, because after all, there are certain parallels between what happens at the global scale and what happens at the regional scale. But it is precisely that set of issues that this panel is going to be grappling with. Are the forces for regional integration, are the trade-offs for regional integration actually fundamentally different from the forces for globalization? Because if they're not, then we have exactly the same issues, that regional integration, like globalization, benefits some people, it benefits economies overall, but it leaves many others behind. And when you think about it, just in terms of principle, before we unpack the details, there's lots of reason to be not so sanguine, not so optimistic that what the previous panel said will just hand over to regional integration and regional institutions to solve the problem. Because what are the challenges here? Whether we're talking about globalization or regional integration, without going into the details, there are two large forces. The first is globalization, regional integration increases the size of the market that you have access to. That makes your economy more prosperous. You can sell to more people. But at the same time, globalization comes with more intense competition. And this more intense competition is what divides the audience, it's what divides the gallery. Because more intense competition to those economies that are richer will have one effect, and more intense competition to those economies that are poorer will have the opposite effect. So what do I mean? We've spent a lot of time today talking about the rise of inequality. And we have marveled at how Asia does not seem to have suffered the kind of angst and nationalist populism that has befuddled the West. But when you stop to think about it, the West is a richer part of the world. The poorer parts of the population in the West are now, with globalization, competing with billions of many more poorer people. The forces of competition will draw their wages down. Inequality increases in richer countries. The opposite happens in poorer economies, economies like Asia, because when Asia opens up, it starts to compete with those economies that have higher wages. What happens to the wages of its people? They all rise. So it divides the world, whether in globalization or in regional integration. Competition divides the world. That is what the write-up has been for this session. Is regional integration utopian? Even as we all agree, regional integration benefits because it increases the size of the marketplace. Is it utopian in the sense that regional institutions are able to overcome the problems that global institutions cannot? Okay. So that is the background, and I want to turn now to my panel. I'm going to begin from this side of the room and then head on to the other side. We're going to begin with Mr. Bandid, who is currently at Hitotsubashi University, previously Deputy Governor for Financial and Economic Stability at the Bank of Thailand. After that, we're going to move to Rebecca Santamaria, who is currently Executive Director of the APEC Secretariat. Previously, she was an architect of many, many regional trade and regional agreements. So we would like to get her insight on whether regional integration really is different from globalization. And finally, I want to turn to Michael Hu is a lawyer and investment professional who is involved in managing private equity, financing, and investment relations across the Asia-Pacific region. I want them to unpack for us whether the regional really is different from the global. Can we, as Manu said, look to the regional to save the global? Bandid, to begin.
Thank you, Dean. Thank you for the invitation, and very pleased to be here to join the panel. When I look at the title, I thought, well, this is not too difficult because of the benefits of integration that we know. But unpacking the forces according to what has been described is really something that we need to think about, because we learn well from the experience of countries in the West that eventually these sort of forces will come to Asia, and also will be the challenge for us. Let me speak maybe on three topics. The first one is on the context of globalization and regional integration that I see now in Asia, and then look at the benefits that we have, and then maybe move forward into how do we going to sustain these benefits in the context of the unpacking that Dean mentioned. And what can we do in anticipation of that force? I think if you go back to this morning, the minister said very clearly that integration rests on a key idea that common prosperities can be promoted and can be achieved around by countries in the region by leveraging on their strengths, on their complementarities, and on their specialization for the common goods of the region. I think this is a very strong and powerful concept. And if you think in terms of the current era of globalization, I think the economic rationale underlying this concept is stronger than even before. First, the global economy have become more and more globalized with more connectivity. So the enabler for reaching out, deepening the forces of globalization is there. Okay, people can fly from places and now much easier than before. And second is that the failure or the challenge of the multilateralism in trade is now being challenged by the policies of the major economies. So the issue comes, where do we retreat to? Do we give up the multilateral system altogether? Or do we have a fallback position, which is, let's do something in a smaller scale, and hence, to sustain the concept of regional integration. But the last force, which I think is very clear, is that, the issues facing emerging markets throughout the world, especially in Asia, is now having, is becoming more and more global. It's a global problem, like capital flows. But the policy conduct that we are responding to these issues are local, okay? Thailand did this, Malaysia did this, and so on. So as a result, our policy response to the problem that are becoming more global has become less effective. And hence it's called for the question whether, policy collaboration between countries can be thought of so that we can help strengthen the capacity to respond to the problems that are global in nature. So I think these are the three forces that provide a context of attempting to further deepening regional integration as a way to cope with the current uncertainty and pressure in the global economy. Now, for the Asian region, I think we had a long history of collaboration, but it was the Asian financial crisis in the late 1990s that really sort of brought home the importance of managing risk of crisis as a group, rather than each individual country try to manage risk of crisis individually. And as a result of this thinking, it has led to a proliferation of policy deliberation by countries in the region to strengthen economic integration, financial integration, as well as to set up a central mechanism like a financial safety net to better manage or prevent the risk of crisis. This is what the Ho-E talked about in the last session. This is the AMRO, the CMIM, the regional financial facility, to manage the risk of crisis. And if you look at what has been happened since then, we're going back about 20 years now. I think it's clear that the benefit has been positive. Asia has become one of the fastest growing regions in the world and maybe the most dynamic. And if you look at what happened after the GFC in the early 2008, you can see that the strength of the ASEAN performance has rested mainly on the growth of intra-regional trade and investment that had provided the fallback position when the global economy got weaker. And this was stimulated partly by the rise of China in the global economy and the deepening of the participation of Asian countries in the global value chain. But you can see that, with rising income and prosperities, when you travel around Asia, you can see that everybody seems to be benefiting, from this new era of globalization in Asia. And now it has been extended not only on manufactured goods. In the services industry, we also see this benefit. Thailand now, enjoying income from tourism. We are among the first destination in Asia for tourism, and then it extends to education and also logistics. So these are clear benefit that so-called regional economic integration have led to. But on the financial front, let me also say that there has also been huge progress in terms of financial integration. At the time when we had the GFC, liquidity in the global market was drying, but we had this support from cash flow and liquidity coming from other Asian banks like Japanese bank that were providing the liquidity to the region, which helped to cushion the impact of liquidity to countries in Asia. On the foreign direct investment, we are seeing more and more active participation of countries like Malaysia, Singapore, investing, in other countries in the regions, thereby helping to lift the upgrading the productive capacities of countries like Myanmar, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. So I think, things are happening around us, and we can see the benefits of that. But I think one of the things that we have to bear in mind, which leads to the issues of confidence and trust that we spoke about this morning, is the setting up of CMIM, the regional financial safety net, that provide a comfort for the region that if anything ever happened again in terms of crisis, we will now have our own facility to manage that risk and prevent the crisis from got out of hand. Before the Asian financial crisis, we did not have this facility, and hence, the Asian region had become totally dependent on the IMF and on the Western capital. But now, with our own regional financing facility, we can be more assured that if anything happened, we would have the forces of the region to come in and help contain the problems. So it provides greater confidence for economic players in the region to think long term and to even go deeper in terms of regional financial integrations. And just a small footnote, in the last 20 years, no major crisis in Asia, okay? So this sort of collaboration and policy have helped to strengthen the discipline of policy making and also provide the sort of assurance that we have the mechanism to manage ourselves. Now, going forward, can we sustain it? Can we sustain it? I think this morning we talk about so many aspects of what we can do. We talk about digital technology, right? We talk about infrastructure investment, and we talk about governance. I think these are the three key areas that we need to put our effort on to help strengthen and to help sustain the benefit of globalization that we have seen. In Thailand now, next month and next week, we're going to have the election. And if you see the poster in terms of the policies, they're all about, helping helping the less privileged to manage, the economic consequences of growth, meaning that, the growth that we have seen, we have to accept that there is a trickle-down process which are not working well, and hence many parties, sort of have a policy to increase transfer income and so on. So this is an example that this sort of thing that we talk about this morning, it's there, Income inequalities in many countries in Asia is increasing. The question is, as a policies, what can we do to help to prevent this sort of thing to become a major problem? So my idea is that we should go for three things. First, digital improvement across the region. So far, the integration have been done mainly on trade and investment. So the next step should be on digital and infrastructure. So we can build platforms that can provide facility that many businesses can share to save costs and so on. And I think in the financial sector, these are now becoming, and in things to do. I know many projects and efforts to try to think about having a common regional digital platform to help with the liberalization and the modernization of the financial sector. The same can be said about physical infrastructure, to have a shared common facility that can help promoting longer-term development. Now, on issues of governance, I came to think of this. There are two issues here. First is the corporate governance of companies, right? Inequality partly comes from the fact that companies is making too much money, right? So it's a question of is the way they make money ethical? Are they responsible businesses and so on? So I think the first part of governance is about increasing or improving the corporate governance commitment of companies, so as to ensure a fair, ethical, and responsible business practices in the region, which indirectly will help to reduce the issues of inequality. But the second point is something that I picked up from the minister this morning, that you also need better political governance in the sense of improving the institution of the capacity of the political institutions to make hard choices, right? So that, something that we fear happening will not be happening, as a way of sustaining the benefit of globalization by minimizing the risk that we will have the problem like in many other countries. So I think these are the three things that we can move on to strengthen regional integration. And I think I'm glad to say that many of these aspects are now in developments in the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bandid, for those two themes that I heard you describe. One is you did unpack for us a global and regional context from a Thailand ASEAN perspective. That made it very clear. There's some things there that I'm sure we will want to come back to. And then the second theme you gave us was some general principles on going forwards that have to do with digital economy and governance, which are general. They apply as much to ASEAN and Asia as they do to the global setting. Rebecca, may I invite you to come in on this now?
Thank you very much. I just got back from the first meeting this year of the senior officials for APEC. And there was a whole lot of conversation around regional economic integration. Well, that's a key part of what APEC does. But more interestingly, is this year the chair is Chile, and Chile has decided to focus on the digital economy, on inclusive growth. By inclusiveness, they incorporate the small and medium enterprises, women, and very interestingly, the indigenous group. They also have integration as one of their key priority areas. And I forget the fourth one, but I've got a colleague who's sitting there. She must remind me. But anyways, the point is that the conversation around integration, again, and APEC is a non-binding voluntary body. So and when you talk of a voluntary body, and talking about economic integration is a bit odd, because integration always involves commitment, some kind of binding. So you have the APEC model, where you put in place practices, you talk of disciplines, you talk of governance issues, you talk about sustainability of development, etc. Then you have, on the other hand, ASEAN, which is a binding environment, where you have agreements. And then you have the EU. How do these compare? The EU and ASEAN are are integrated regions, but with a difference. In the case of ASEAN, it's what we call an open regionalism, where ASEAN member states can then still engage in bilateral arrangements, whereas in the EU you can't do bilateral arrangements. EU also has a common external tariff. ASEAN does not. ASEAN has an internal. So among ourselves, we have a tariff that's common. However, if you're exporting to ASEAN from another country, say to Vietnam, you pay a different tariff. To Singapore, you'd pay 0. To Malaysia, you pay a different tariff. So there is no common external tariff, unlike the EU. That's a customs union, So there are differences in economic integration. But let me come back to some of the points raised about what we're doing, looking regional to save the global. Is that possible? And I think that's where we're making a difference in the regional sphere. The whole conversation has to be around why do you want to do this? So the governments will have one reason for attempting this, but the business also will have its own reasons. So for example, in the case of APEC, it is a business community, the APEC Business Advisory Council, that put this on the table. They want the economies to work towards the free trade arrangement or free trade area, that's the fine line there, of the Asia Pacific, the FTAP. So a lot of work. The businesses put this proposal on the table in 2005, but it's 2019 today and it's still a proposal, okay? But an outsider looking in will say, you've done nothing. But the folks inside understand how complex it is to get to this free trade agreement or arrangement of the Asia Pacific. There are so many things that need to be done, different parts of an agreement that need to be sorted out, whether it's financial, whether it's customs, all these and areas that need to be worked out. So that's actually a work in progress. There's studies done, and there's work that's being done on different aspects to get us to the free trade area of the Asia Pacific. ASEAN, in the meantime, is also working with its 6 dialogue partners on the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. So you've got another big initiative that's going on. That's still being negotiated. And it comes with a whole lot of complexities, both economic and political. And then you have the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. That's already in force. It entered into force last December, and then Vietnam has now joined in. A few countries, Malaysia, Brunei, have yet to ratify. We're all keeping our fingers crossed. We want Malaysia to ratify, but that's a different story. So you've got all these different agreements, and then of course there's the ASEAN Free Trade Area. So you've got all these agreements. How do all these then make sense to a business person? I think that's the more important question for us, and that's why we look to encompass all these agreements into a bigger, more coherent whole. And that's really making business sense. Because if you're a business person trying to do business with these different countries, which have different agreements, it can be extremely complex, because a different set of rules applying to each different partner. And you will hear this conversation as in the Brexit issue. yesterday, as I was listening to the Prime Minister trying to defend her position, she kept talking about rules of origin, rules of origin. That's key. If you're talking of integration from a very basic trade perspective, you cannot avoid talking about the rules of origin. And that's one of the things that motivated ASEAN to engage in the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. Because ASEAN has free trade agreements with 6 of its dialogue partners, and each agreement has a different set of rules. So you want to make sense of it all. For the business community, for the benefit of folks, you have to have simpler rules. So that's one of the big driving forces for ASEAN, to align the rules. And when you're talking of aligning the rules, it not only benefits the big companies, because that's often the criticism against these agreements, is that it benefits the big companies. The small ones, SMEs, they get left out. It's precisely when you're doing that, you're making the rules simple, that you can ensure that the smaller companies get integrated into the supply chain, the value chains of the bigger companies. And that's key to regional economic integration from a business perspective, from an inclusive business perspective, to ensure that the small companies are not left out of these agreements. You work to ensure that your rules, your benefits are streamlined so that the smaller companies become part of your global value chain, your global supply chain. And that is a clear benefit that can come from regional economic integration. When we started talking about ASEAN economic integration, even in APEC, when we talk about regional integration, it's about a rising tide. You put yourself at a certain level, and as everybody improves, you bring along with you the others so that you narrow the gaps. That's a practical way of looking at narrowing gaps. That's one benefit. The other is also because of the work we're doing to enhance trade linkages, economic linkages, you cannot do it without structural reform. So you very subtly make sure that there is structural reform. Because if you want to benefit from it, from the integration, the economic benefits, you have to undertake structural reform. You have to have regulatory coherence across the region, and that really brings the change that's required. So disciplines that are put in place, done at the national level, but to get to a more regional and then eventually global goals as the regional economic integration expands. Sharing of best practices. If you're talking of governance, sharing of best practices, technical cooperation, and these are the building blocks towards ensuring that the benefits are spread out, that you prepare folks. I know there was some conversation around safety nets, but that's how you really step up to ensure that the benefits accrue to everybody. Let me just make one final point on a very tangible outcome of the CPTPP. In all our previous negotiations, we did not include issues of disciplines. It was all about rules, no disciplines. So you've got disciplines on IP protection, on competition policy, on public procurement, on having disciplines for state-owned enterprises to ensure that there is fair, there's a level playing field for everybody. These are disciplines, these are new things that are included in regional economic integration, controversial on some level, but important if we're going to move regional economic integration to a different level and not let it stagnate at the level of just trade and investment facilitation. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Thank you. Thank you for that very rich presentation from your own experience of a range of possibilities that we see out there. I neglected to mention earlier, Rebecca had previously also been Secretary General of Malaysia's Ministry of Trade and Industry. Obviously, she now works on an entirely global stage. She had begun with telling us about the inclusive characteristics of the APEC work, and then from there she went to tell us about a whole range of other regional agreements with all different configurations. So to abuse the language a bit, there's a variable geometry in regional agreements itself, which actually gives us hope for how we can navigate this treacherous globalization landscape. There are many issues you've raised that we want to come back to. We'll hold off on that. And we'll now invite Michael to help us think through what's happening in Asia-Pac.
Sure. Thanks, Professor Quah. And just to answer your question, Dr. Stabmaria, do we understand the rules? We do not understand the rules at all. So maybe if I can take a look at this issue from perhaps a different perspective, being on the ground, investing in the different regions in Asia, and perhaps providing some takeaways from what we can see. So I think integration is always welcomed by the business community. It's what we see as levers for growth in the region, helping the region trade and increasingly use capital efficiently. So how we think about is when we're investing, we don't like allocating capital due to for specific reasons such as currency and for capital control. So we want to allocate capital to regions where we see the potential for growth. So an example is India, where we see currency volatility. So we reduce our investment in India because we're not sure where the currency is going to go. If there is a stable currency there, then we have those less risks, and we're able to deploy capital in the region. Similarly, in China, when we started, there was always the issue of capital control. You can get your money into China, but how do you get your money out? So obviously, we navigate those issues on a daily basis, but they're the concerns of a global investment manager looking to the region is, can I get my money out in time? Sure, China's the biggest growth driver, but what are the risks and concern there? And then the other one that comes to mind is, general kind of economic and fiscal policies that we see across the region. Certain developing economies tend to have more, I would say, volatile political situations, and that always causes a concern for us when we're allocating capital into the region. So I guess my key takeaway from this is that if we had a more regionally integrated region with more stability, less currency fluctuations across the region, then the allocators of capital would be able to more freely move in the regions and allocate capital to where we see the opportunities lie. And maybe perhaps I can provide some real-life examples, is that this is where we see kind of the growth and the role that particularly international capital has to play in Asia, because a lot of our capital is from developed nations. So, for example, we backed a fund manager who invested in a fish farm in Vietnam. So this is a very low-cost structure investment. They're the lowest cost producer in Asia, cheaper than any other economy. They actually export a lot of their product to France, which is where my firm is from, interestingly enough. So to be able to do that and to be able to invest in that company allows the people there to be enriched and to help the company grow. It develops the region, but it also helps the people globally because the end consumer benefits in France from lower cost structures as well. So there can be dual benefits to the investment and to the cost structure kind of paradigm. And similarly, another example perhaps we can provide is, and which is maybe controversial given the context of all these trade talks, is manufacturing China, which is still kind of a sector which is a little bit older now, but very developed. So we're invested in a manufacturer in China which exports a lot of precision, kind of high-grade manufacturing to US companies. So the question is, this is the lowest cost structure producer in the world by far. So they produce at a much lower price than the US counterparts. What is the logic of introducing subsidies in the US to protect that industry when the US is no longer competitive? So, I think that kind of rationale benefits both parts. One is that our China producer continues to make profits, and then the US end consumer buys these products at a cheaper price. So it's a question of what kind of intervention do you have? And then to touch on the doctor's point on digital disruption, I think that's quietly right. I think the digital infrastructure needs to be there, needs to grow in Asia. And I think what's been good to see is that Asia has actually been a little bit on the forefront of that digital transformation. So you see companies like Alibaba in China, and Alibaba was the first B2C company in China to develop. Like the US did not have that model yet. until, you know, they come up with Amazon, and it's kind of been catching up in China in some respects in terms of the, you know, the digital development, and then also that expands into Southeast Asia with Lazada and all these trade platforms which are cooperating e-commerce online. So we see these as really, you know, supportive of the region and something unique about the region where, you know, we can facilitate trade on these platforms. And then you'll have the other kind of, you know, the other good Asian stories such as the doctor mentioned before, like Grab and Gojek, which are regional players who have come out of the region, and they offer services that no one else in the world offers. Like, you can do things on Grab and Gojek that you can't do in the US, and it's showing that, you know, Asia can be on the forefront of that digital innovation and use that to be the kind of to benefit all the nations in our economies. And I think that's probably my key points.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks very much for that actually very refreshing business perspective on these issues that we've been discussing. There's a tendency for us to sort of get carried away with the sort of big picture notions of, oh, globalization, inequality, all these changes, and we forget that what drives globalization are people actually doing things on the ground, making capital allocation decisions based on certain signals that they see. And your descriptions have been wonderful. You've reminded us of the fish farm in Vietnam that's actually lifted people out of poverty. You've reminded us of the kind of innovation in technology that we see in Asia and China, whether it's Gojek or Grab or Tencent, Alibaba, Taobao. You know, the Kai-Fu Lee, whose name had come up earlier already, has, you know, other descriptions of how, you know, the traditional picture of China cheating at trade by simply undervaluing its currency or subsidizing its industry is so wrong compared to what actually happens in its technological innovation process. The competition is cutthroat. They have led the world in online to offline business, whether it's in Taobao or Tencent or Alibaba delivery. And that's really wonderful, fresh insight to bring in that we should have done earlier. Now, I would like you to get involved in the conversation as well. To kick that off, perhaps I could begin with some questions for the panel, connect up some of your conversations, then lead into people who want to ask questions. If you want to ask questions, make your way to the microphones, and I'll pick up on your lead. But to begin, let me talk about something that both Michael and Rebecca have referred to. Michael's wonderful example of the Vietnamese fish farm, and Rebecca's evocative language of the ASEAN's rising tide, lifting all boats. That reminds us of the wonderful liberating experiences that Asia, ASEAN have been able to enjoy out of ever greater trade integration. So to stretch the metaphor a bit, when earlier, both in this session and in earlier sessions, we talked about how Western advanced economies seem to no longer appreciate this poverty reduction, incoming tide lifting all boats phenomenon anymore. And it might well be that when we think about the income distributions in Western advanced economies, the metaphor, the picture, is not that of a rising tide lifting all boats, but instead a geological tectonic shock that pulls one part of the landscape up and pushes down the other part of the landscape. The income distribution fractures in Western advanced economies, whereas in developing, emerging economies, whether in Thailand, Vietnam, across ASEAN, it is still a rising tide lifting all boats. And I think we need to be sensitive to this tension between how different parts of the world are experiencing growth and inequality episodes. It is not the case that globalization raises income inequality everywhere in the world. In significant chunks of the world, it is doing poverty reduction. It is a rising tide lifting all boats. And there's a tension here, because then when we talk about we need to reform the international institutions, we need new rules, we need this, that, and the other, the we is no longer so obvious. It is one set of we's when we talk about Asia's experiences, and it's a different set of we when we talk about Western developed economy experiences. One of the benefits to this kind of French, Singapore, Europe, Asia conversations is we get to be open about that. And we get to think through the kind of repairs that we might need. So I wonder if Michael, Rebecca, you have some reactions, and then I'll turn to Bandid in a minute, some reactions to how the world fractures in its experiences. When you have your Asia-Pacific experience, you do your capital allocation decisions, it is a benefit all around. It is a win-win. And I wonder if you are seeing, hearing pushback from other parts of the world on how globalization doesn't actually do all these things that you say are so good. Similarly, Rebecca, when you travel to on your work on APEC, whether you see this kind of pushback. Can I invite Michael first and then Rebecca?
So that's an interesting question. I guess how I would answer that is like, we try and find, as capital allocators, I mean, our goal is to find the greatest return. So we look for capital cost structures which are the most efficient. So what I would say to that is, there are always going to be winners and losers in this kind of trade negotiation, in this kind of service-based swapping industry. So, for example, if a China producer is more efficient than the US, then the US producer is going to miss out on that opportunity. But I guess what my thinking around it is, you can't allocate capital and you can't protect industries that are inefficient because it's not beneficial globally long term. It's not something that you can long-term sustain. So I grew up in Australia. You know, there are certain sectors in Australia which are very inefficient due to kind of government regulations and concerns around labour and the kind of the free flow of labour into the country. You're protecting industries, but over the long term, I think it's going to be structurally inefficient to keep protecting those industries because it doesn't make you competitive in the global market. So like, I guess, the theme of the panelists earlier, it's all about, you know, reskill, education, investment, and changing and seeing kind of the structural shifts in your economies and trying to react to those over the long term, because it's really about upskilling. And, you know, we used to have car production in Australia. It just doesn't make sense to be there, right? So why do that over the long term? So you move your labor force around, you reskill them into industries which make the most sense, and then that benefits everyone globally.
Thank you. This reminds us of, you know, an underlying proposition we need to bear in mind more and more. Policy should protect the worker, not the job. Our ultimate responsibility is to people. And we often think that by giving them all jobs, we actually do them a benefit. Actually, we don't. We end up holding back progress that could actually improve their material well-being. And the Australia example that you've given of an auto industry and others that you were telling me about in our prior conversation are wonderful instances of that. Rebecca, do you want to share some of this as well?
I think for us, it's, when I say us, I mean whether it's APEC or ASEAN, it's about managing the asymmetries, especially when you're talking about the digital economy and the work that's going on in that sphere. It's really about managing those asymmetries, and we spend some time talking about this, not just across the country to country or economy to economy kind of asymmetries, but also within the country. So there's a lot of conversation about, you know, you want to include everybody in this, so everybody benefits from all the initiatives that we've undertaken, and one way to go about this is the digital economy, and then, you know, make sure everybody's on the web, make sure e-commerce is the way to go. That's a very interesting conversation, but you have to ensure that that is accompanied by infrastructure development, the investment in infrastructure, and make sure access to broadband, those things, the necessary skills. You have to make sure that there is trust in the system, that how do you manage data flows, how do you manage privacy. All these things have to be in a package. You can't just say, oh, we're going to promote e-commerce. And very often, it's so easy for, I'm sorry if there are politicians in the room, I don't mean to offend you. It's so easy for politicians to go on this bandwagon and say, yeah, you know, e-commerce is the way to go. But really, and then do not support it with the necessary, you know, infrastructure and everything else that comes with it. So if you're talking about poverty reduction or reducing the gaps, these are things that we must equally pay attention to. And in APEC, that's the conversation that we're having. How do we build capacity? How do we ensure that there is connectivity, whether it's physical, whether it's institutional, whether it's people to people? A key part of the digital economy is regulatory coherence across the economies, right? I mean, you can't have different sets of rules every time you try and engage. You can, but it's going to be mind-boggling. It's going to be very difficult to navigate. So those are some of the areas that there is a lot of focus. And the value of APEC, is that you can have these conversations because it's non-binding. The moment you're in a binding environment, you start to posture, and that makes it difficult to get to some level of regulatory coherence, really, and the effort towards structural reform becomes even more difficult. So that's my input on that.
Okay, Rebecca, can I be a little bit mischievous, maybe, and ask you to say more about the non-binding, voluntary nature to APEC? One of the discussions I was having recently with some members of a G20 Secretariat, where there too in the G20, it's also non-binding, it's also voluntary. And there is a cynicism that develops around such organizations. If you're voluntary and non-binding, what exactly is your output? What is the key performance indicator against which you measure your results at the end of the year? If it is simply issuing a communique, which is what the G20 does a lot of, where exactly is the value? So perhaps you can help us think about APEC and how that helps here.
Yeah, well, in APEC, it's non-binding, but there are clear initiatives. We talk of what can be done on the ground. And again, and the economies themselves contribute to promoting some of these initiatives. So there are a whole bunch of technical exchanges, sharing of best practices. So it's in that context. For example, when we did the environmental goods, we wanted to look at liberalizing the tariffs on environmental goods. It was a struggle at the World Trade Organization. So, and if you get 108, 160 plus countries trying to figure this out, you can get nowhere. You can go around in circles. So what APEC is like an incubator. So APEC economists started talking about what is it that we can, how do we define environmental goods? What kind of tariffs are we looking at? How much can we bring that down to? And it is just that through that conversation, we then came to an agreement, not non-binding, that these are the products that we should strive to bring the tariffs down. And there was traction among the economies, and then when there was enough of this like-minded positioning, we moved it to the WTO, and then WTO takes it and makes it a binding agreement. Similar things happen at the trade facilitation agreement. If you recall how difficult it was to get to a trade facilitation agreement at the WTO, but in APEC we worked at it, and it's like-minded countries willing and able, getting a core, critical mass, as it were, and then elevating it to the WTO and says, look, here, we've done it voluntarily, now you guys can take it on. And that's how we work towards the trade facilitation agreement at the WTO. There are a few other examples.
Interesting. Yeah. I might come back to that. I want to turn to Mr. Bandid on a number of the things you said. But again, let me remind you, I'm not going to turn around and ask that this is the time to speak up. So when you're ready, whenever you're ready, just go to the microphone and I will see you. But I want to turn to Mr. Bandid now, because my conversations with Michael and Rebecca have been much more on the, if one wants to simplify it, much more on the real side issues, trade, actual provision of goods and services. And you've, of course, talked to us about financial and monetary arrangements as well, understandably from your previous perspective in the Bank of Thailand. And I wanted to pick up on something that you said that was very intriguing in our journey between the regional and the global. Because at one point you said the issues that face the financial and monetary conditions for emerging economies are global. They come from the international flows of capital. They are, large pools of capital in the world from wherever seeking entry into this part of the world and others. So they are challenges that don't have passports. They're not confined to a particular geography. But then you very quickly said, but the policy responses that we have from here in ASEAN can only be local. So we're trying to deal with global forces using local weapons. The protection that we can avail from our local weaponry is limited. But there are some that are very good, like regional insurance agreements like Chiang Mai. At the same time, however, the rest of the world is sometimes critical of our regional insurance arrangements. They say, we already provide a global safety net, IMF. Why are you using these excess savings, which then destabilizes the world in providing regional safety arrangements? I wonder if you could speak to this tension between the local and global and help us unpack which way to go.
Thank you for this question. I think it's been on my mind for a long, long time. The recent example is the QE in all the major central banks. And the amount of liquidity has been created. All this money has to be parked somewhere in terms of investment. So they come to Asia, huge capital flow, all countries. What can we do as a country, to manage the implication of that capital flow and the risk that it could have on financial stability? So we have our own, tools and exchange rate, currency intervention, and regulations. It's not enough to manage. What if we do something out of the box, like using regulation, capital control? Well, it could be effective in the sense that if Thailand were to do it, capital flow would not come to Thailand now because the cost too much. So it might go to Indonesia instead. It might go to the Philippines. So we are passing the burden of that to other countries. Philippines said too much capital flow, I cannot manage. So Philippines decided to also raise the tax on capital flow, capital control. So the money flow then goes elsewhere, maybe to Indonesia, right? So it really shows that domestic policy response is not effective in dealing with this, and it creates spillover effect to other economies. Then the question is, what if countries in Asia get together and collaborate on the policy response? Supposing, this is just supposing, okay? All countries in Asia, maybe ASEAN, have decided that, okay, we will adopt a similar tax on capital flows for the whole region, same standard, maybe 15%, 10%. Then the money will not be coming to the region for a while because of that. Right, but it might go somewhere else, right? But the point here is that individual economy ability to manage the risks that are becoming more global or has a global orientation is becoming less effective, and hence we need to think of somewhere to think about policy collaboration at a greater context. Okay, so this is something that is being talked a lot about, but has not been able to activate in the sense that many policymakers in the region still have different view about that this might not be suitable for the fact that my economy is being open, it's known to be very open. This sort of thing will not go down well and so on. So there are these things. So this is something that I think the countries will need to think about and then to work on. Now come from the second issues about the regional financing facility and the global financial facility. I think a key lesson we learned from the Asian financial crisis is that by becoming totally dependent on the IMF, you don't have anything at all apart from your own reserve, right? To look after yourself. And the key issue that we need to be clear in seeking assistance from abroad is predictability, right? In terms of, and the timeliness. You know exactly how much you're going to get when you make a move and when you're going to get it. But the Asian financial crisis showed that it is a huge problem here because, the IMF might make decision 2 or 3 weeks, after things over, when you need it now and so on. So it's a question of whether we can develop so-called the second line of defense in between, meaning that, you know, when your currency is under pressure, you might try to look after yourself first. That's the first line of defense. And then if we have a regional efforts, you know, to try to fill in the gap, you know, and then that could be your second line of defense. And then the IMF, you know, the global financial architecture could be your third line of defense. So we are not competing with the IMF, or we are not doing something redundant. It's something that can complement, right? The safety of financial assistance in the context whereby this issue of predictability and timeliness is not there. Okay, if you look at the way CIM has been developed, it consists of two parts. Maybe the first 30% or so is readily available, but then the remaining part would need to be linked to an IMF program. So at least in terms of liquidity management, that could be something that become available more so than before, that we don't have and anything else. So, you know, institutions like CMIM and so on, I see that as something that can complement a facility in the global setting that can help create more comfort and more certainty in managing the risk of capital flow that are coming, you know, from abroad.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's very helpful and clarifying. I wanted to come around to the other side of the room now, to Michael. And I'm struck by one of the things that you began your intervention with. The business community always welcomes integration. It increases business opportunities. And I want you to say a little bit more about that, how you see the reaction of the American business community in the current period with the US-China trade war. Because obviously there, the business community has changed its tune in the United States. And do you think the forces there are appropriate? How do you see that unfolding? And then I'll come to you, sir.
Sure.
So that's a tricky question.
I didn't mean it to be tricky. I think we really want to know the answer to that.
So I think about it. So I used to work for a US firm, and we invest with some US firms in the region. I think not all facets of the American business community think that, you know, the trade war is in anyone's interests. I think, you know, in the investment community, what the investment community loves is consistency. They like everything to be boring. They actually really like regulation, because it ensures that things are done properly and ensures that bubbles and markets aren't created and that you don't have kind of asset spikes in the market. So I think I think the business community does really welcome, you know, integration, as long as it's done consistently and in a prudent manner. And similar to what Dr. Mario said was about the markets, and the approach is that as long as it's applied and executed in a prudent way, it's very much welcomed by the business community. So I would say that one half, perhaps, at least in the investment community, we really welcome kind of consistency and stable laws and rules.
I think we can all sign up to that. Stability is a good thing. Yes, sir, please.
Hi, my name is Michael Petraeus from Critical Spectator. I'd like to ask a question about your views on the future of ASEAN and its integration, because it seems that it has only two scenarios to follow. Either it's going to integrate together as a sort of counterweight to China, or it's going to be integrated by China. So what are your thoughts on that?
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask Rebecca to kick us off on that.
ASEAN has been on this journey for more than 50 years, and we will continue to be on this journey. Like I said, regional economic integration is a work in progress. If you see how we've done it, and again, my bias is economic integration. I'm not very au fait with the political integration aspect. But from an economic integration, the work that we've been doing is really phased in, and it's step by step to some extent, to the extent that some folks think we're too slow. But given what we see unfolding globally, I think ASEAN's okay. It's on the right track. It's meeting its challenges. It's evolving. It's taking on board global developments as it moves on towards integration. Now, the question of China, I know this is often asked of us, especially in the context of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP. And often it is said that it is China-driven. But to be fair, RCEP was an ASEAN creation. ASEAN wanted this integration because, as I said earlier, ASEAN has free trade agreements with the partners that are involved, and each agreement has a different set of rules. Now, it's very complex when you, like Prof. Danny says, you want to navigate it. For business, it is really complex. So we really work to, one, have, we're trying to streamline the rules. Two, we're also trying to look at regulations, regulatory coherence across the region. And again, ASEAN is in the driving seat. It is a complex agreement, and that's why it's gone on for quite a while. It's missed 3 deadlines already, and this year, just a couple of weeks ago, the ministers met in Bangkok to chart a way forward. Really you cannot have this open-ended. You can't have negotiations going on ad nauseum. You have to have some kind of closure. So it was a good sign that the ministers met soon after they met in Singapore to try and find a way forward. So it is not accurate to say that this whole thing is in reaction to or driven by China.
Thank you, Rebecca. Mr. Bandid, would you like to come in on ASEAN and China? And then I'll turn to Michael and then yourself after.
I think we cannot ignore, the prominent role of China in Asia. But I think the two-track integration, can go hand in hand. The ASEAN themselves, the ASEAN 10, we are now promoting continued regional integration in the context of ASEAN itself, okay? But the fact that the rise in the global value chain, where China played the central role, have pulled ASEAN countries into the network of China production capacity, and we can see that when something happens, it affects countries in the region. And so I think that going forward, we can see that these two tracks need to both go on, ASEAN and China, and ASEAN among themselves. I think so that should be my view.
Michael, you say you grew up in Australia, you've worked in Hong Kong, you're moving to Singapore. Can you give us a perspective on the ASEAN and China question?
I'd probably just add to the comments is that it's really the push-pull effect. I think that, China's becoming a larger political force in the region, and it's really attracting themselves and pushing ASEAN, pulling and pushing ASEAN towards them a little bit.
Okay, thank you. Madam, please.
Thank you so much. It has been a wonderful day. Thank you to everybody. My name is Chaitri Hapugal. I've been with the World Bank for a long time. I've taken some time out after I became a citizen of Singapore. I felt that I wanted to come back to Asia and contribute. So I'm here trying to learn and understand Asia from the perspective of Asia, and then trying to understand how and what I can learn in terms of thinking about other regions. But having given this introduction, my question is really about global agreements versus regional agreements. And I was very encouraged to hear from Rebecca about how ASEAN has succeeded. So it's a very naive question. Why do we need the World Trade Organization?
Yes, why do we need the WTO?
We do. For predictability, consistency, trade is not just bilateral, trade is global. At the end of the day, you want that level of predictability. Rules making has to be at the multilateral level. Yes, regionally we can make rules, but we are just trading among ourselves. But at the end of the day, that's not it. We also have a wider reach. And I think businesses especially, we keep hearing this from the business community, that they want the WTO to work. They want the global rules so that it makes so much sense. And to have rules, varying rules every time you do business in a different part of the world, that's the value of the WTO. But everybody also agrees that you need to have reform. WTO needs to come up to speed with what's going on. There is some work now being done on e-commerce, for example. When you have 100 over countries, it is a slow-moving train. It is difficult. And that's why you saw that the Doha round never went anywhere. It's being pulled on all sides. But having said all that, that's why at APEC we try and work to at least start the conversation, start the ball rolling, as it were, and then elevate it to the WTO, because it's faster that way. We've seen our success in the information technology agreements, 1 and 2, and then the trade facilitation agreement, the environmental goods agreement. And now we're working very hard to ensure that the work we do in e-commerce gets the support at the WTO. So it is a slow process, but you need multilateral rules for predictability and consistency.
Thank you, Rebecca. We're coming to the end of the session, and I want you to just go around the panel to see if there are any final thoughts you want to make sure we are impressed with as we walk out of the room on the regional and the global. So I want to begin with you, Michael. Any final thoughts that we should keep in mind, a soundbite that we want to take away with us?
Sure. I think the only two things that I think of when I come to that, and I've perhaps spoken of previously, is just consistent application. Like ASEAN's doing really great work. As long as executed consistently across all the states, and as long as you have agreement, I think that's what we like. And we like regulation and consistency, and to make sure that it's also executed in a prudent and kind of considered manner.
Excellent. Thank you. Rebecca.
Regional economic integration is a work in progress, and it has to evolve with developments, with global developments. It cannot be a one point in time kind of initiative.
Thank you, Rebecca. Mr. Bandid.
I think the consequence of integration in terms of income inequalities, is something that we must not forget, because that is something that can happen. But this morning we talked mainly about inequality in income and in wealth. But I think one thing that we need to be careful is the issues of inequality in access. Access to education, access to healthcare, access to good job employment, access to credit. Because without this, transferring of money can help to make people feel good for maybe for a day or two, but without better access to opportunities, then that hope will not be there. Okay. So I think the theme going forward in terms of regional integration would need to be focusing on, of course, productivity increase, as always, using more digital technology. And the second one is on inclusiveness of the whole process itself, which we will be able to raise that hope through greater access to opportunities.
Thank you, Mr. Bandit. We're coming to the end of the session, and I want to bring this to a close in maybe just a moment's reflection, both on the panel and on the proceedings from today. And let me begin by just pointing out something that seems to be a very small thing, but I am so taken and enthusiastic with Michael's can-do attitude on the global system or on the regional system. He says, look, bring me any system you want, but make sure that it's clear, it's transparent, it's implemented well, then it's something we can work with. That stability matters to us much more than maybe even the small details of each particular agreement. Having noted that, of course, if we had our druthers, if we could choose, we still want to choose those systems that do the best for as many people as possible, keeping to Michael's dictum that they be predictable and stable. So let me conclude by picking up on this question about the WTO. The question was, why do we still need the WTO? And it might be that we don't actually have a choice in whether we can keep the WTO. Part of the WTO's job is not just to set the rules, but to serve as in an adjudication role. That adjudication role typically takes 7 judges. We're now down to 3. general view is that America has continued to block the appointment of these appellate judges. Over the next few months, the third of them will retire, and then we're down to 2, in which case we actually no longer have an adjudication panel. So we no longer have that available to us. But that brings us to the final conclusion I want to leave us with in the last 44 seconds. And that is that as we think about global and regional systems, we want to be crystal clear about the systems that are best versus the systems that we can get. The systems that we can have, the systems that we can work with, need not always be the best, but they are good enough for getting the job done, for continuing to lift hundreds of millions of Asians out of poverty, for continuing a peaceful and stable world. It might be that we can no longer achieve the multilateralism, the extreme multilateralism that's characterized the world over the last 7 decades. But we can go with what someone earlier this morning said, the coalition of the willing, a plurilateralism, a variable geometry of subgroups that find particular configurations good enough to work with. And that might be already really good for what we want to achieve out of new horizons for the world economy. So that brings this day's proceedings to a close. I want to thank all of you for your attention throughout the day, but then finally get you to join me in thanking our fabulous panel this afternoon.